Have you ever imagined what you would do if you saw an orphan girl being publicly humiliated, alone, with no one around to defend her? Amid the noise of the fair, with screaming vendors and customers in a hurry, a little girl desperately tries to sell some flowers to get some food. But instead of compassion, she encounters the contempt, the debauchery, and even the cruelty of those who are supposed to help her. And when all seemed lost, something completely unexpected happens. A dirty, thin and apparently abandoned stray dog emerges as a true protective angel. How can a simple animal be the only defense between evil and innocence? Was it just a coincidence? Or is there something much bigger behind this unlikely encounter? Have you ever been through something like this, where life puts someone in your path at the exact right time? Enjoy the video, subscribe to the channel and get ready, because what comes next will surprise you. In the heart of that bustling city, where the sound of the stalls opening mingled with the hurried shouts of the vendors, Clara began another day of struggle. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet, but his little feet were already touching the cold, damp floor of the sidewalks. Her worn thin clothes could barely shield her from the biting wind that snaked through the narrow streets, while her stiffened fingers carefully grasped the small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself before dawn. Each flower represented a hope, a possibility of getting a few coins to perhaps buy a loaf of bread or a hot soup. The fair soon came to life. The stalls lined up like a huge, colorful maze, exuding irresistible aromas of fresh fruit, cheese, freshly baked breads and steaming hot dishes. The vibrant colors of the fruit shimmered in the dim morning light, and the sweet smell of freshly picked apples seemed to mock the constant hunger that squeezed the girl's stomach. All around, men and women ran in a hurry, carrying bags full of groceries, but no one stopped to truly see that small figure with large and sad eyes, planted in a discreet corner, spreading the flowers in search of a look of compassion. Clara's face carried a pure innocence, but there was also a trace of hidden strength, a force that even at such a young age had already learned to resist loneliness, cold, and daily contempt. No one knew where it came from. No one knew the name of that girl who appeared every day at the fair. Some just saw it as part of the dreary landscape of the streets, an uncomfortable detail in the cheerful setting of busy mornings. Others did not even understand it. But she was there. He always was. Clara had already become accustomed to indifference. He had learned not to expect smiles or kindnesses. His eyes ran over every passing face, looking for that small gesture of humanity that, most of the time, never came. Even so, he did not give up. She stood firm with the flowers in her hands, as someone who carries the little beauty that life still allowed her to hold. At times, one or another older lady would take pity and buy a small repair, leaving a few coins in the worn pocket of the improvised apron. These generous souls were rare, but enough for Clara to return the next day with a thread of renewed hope. With each step inside the fair, Clara felt the cruel contrast between the world around her and her reality. The well-dressed children ran, smiling alongside their parents, licking colorful ice cream or biting into warm bread, while she, barefoot and cold, tried to ignore the emptiness that corroded her stomach. Vendors shouted their offerings enthusiastically. Fresh fruit, artisanal cheeses, homemade sweets. Everything is so plentiful, so close, and at the same time, inaccessible. In the midst of all that movement, no one wondered who that girl alone was. No one asked why at just 10 years old he was there selling flowers while other children played carefree. Mystery hung like a mist around his frail figure. Where did it come from? Where would his parents be? Would he have a family member waiting for him somewhere in the city? Or had the whole world forgotten her? Despite the loneliness that accompanied her like a constant shadow, Claire kept a discreet glint of hope in her eyes. Perhaps it was the innocent strength of a child who, even hurt by life, still believed that something good could happen. Maybe it was just the survival instinct which pushed her every morning to get up, pick flowers and face another day at the cold and indifferent market. As the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the thick clouds, illuminating the roofs of the tents, Clara adjusted her flowers and took a deep breath. Another day began, a day like so many others, or at least that's what she thought. If you're feeling the strength of this story, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which city you're watching from. Now, something unexpected is about to happen. That morning, the fair seemed even busier than usual. The tents were packed, the corridors cramped, and the constant buzz created an almost deafening buzz. Clara, as always, walked slowly among the people, holding tight to the small bouquet of wildflowers so carefully picked at dawn. His gaze scanned every face he passed, hoping to find someone willing to buy a single flower. But something hung in the air, a kind of tension she couldn't explain. Unlike other days, there were looks that accompanied her more incisively, muffled, whispers that escaped the lips of some vendors as they watched her approach. Among the stallholders, a small group began to gather. They were hard-nosed men, accustomed to the routine of the fair and bothered by the constant presence of that fragile girl who, even without taking up any space, seemed to bother them just by existing there. The whispers gained strength and soon turned into spiteful laughter. They watched Clara with a mixture of contempt and amusement, as someone who finds a pastime in the misfortune of others. Her eyes followed the girl's every step, waiting for the right moment to act. When Clara stopped in front of a fruit stand, timidly extending the bouquet to a lady who was examining apples, the teasing began. One of the men, with a sarcastic smile, commented loud enough for everyone around to hear. Others laughed in chorus, encouraged by collective evil. Clara, embarrassed, lowered her gaze but did not back down. He held the flowers tighter, as if they were his only protection against this unexpected attack. His face, already pale from the cold, now took on reddish tones of shame and fear. The lady, uncomfortable with the situation, hurriedly walked away, leaving the girl even more exposed in the middle of the crowded corridor. The vendors, taking advantage of the emptiness around Clara, advanced a few steps. One of them commented on the torn clothes she wore, mocking the pitiful state of the threadbare fabric that could barely cover her small body. Another questioned in an ironic tone how someone with that appearance dared to try to sell flowers there, in the middle of the fair, where real people worked hard to survive. The words were like small needles piercing Clara's emotional resistance. But she remained silent, her eyes beginning to fill with tears but still not shedding them. Her hand trembled, but she wouldn't let go of the bouquet. Each flower she held represented not only the effort of that morning, but also the last remnant of dignity she tried to preserve in the face of the gratuitous cruelty of those men. It was then that one of the stallholders, visibly more aggressive, decided to exceed the limit. With a quick gesture, he tried to hit the girl's arm, intending to knock the flowers to the ground. Clara instinctively recoiled, protecting the bouquet against her chest. The movement made her lose her balance, and she almost fell on her back, but managed to steady herself in one of the nearby crates. The scene drew the attention of the people around even more, who, although they watched everything, remained static, some pretending to observe the goods, others looking away as if ignoring. The injustice might make them less complicit. The tension in the air was palpable. The laughter of the attackers now mixed with an uncomfortable silence coming from the crowd that, although numerous, preferred not to intervene. Clara, with her heart racing, looked around for a friendly face, an outstretched hand, any sign of empathy. But what he found were only empty expressions, fleeting glances and an icy emptiness around him. The loneliness, which was already familiar to him, seemed even heavier in front of that indifferent audience. The stallholders, encouraged by the passivity of the public, felt increasingly free to humiliate her. One of them, in a rough voice, insinuated that perhaps the flowers were not even hers, perhaps she had stolen them from some garden in the city. Another suggested that they call the police, as if they wanted to turn that defenseless child into a criminal in front of everyone. The provocations continued to multiply, fueled by the sickening pleasure of seeing her cornered. The cold of that morning seemed to have intensified. Clara, even trembling, still tried to maintain her posture. Her teary eyes now sparkled, not only from the suppressed tears, but from the desperate attempt not to allow the attackers to see her crumble. The bouquet, pressed against his chest, was his fragile shield against the maelstrom of verbal aggression and threatening gestures. Around the fair went on with its usual routine, as if that scene was just another passing curiosity. People kept buying, trading, hurriedly walking between the stalls trying to ignore the tension unfolding right before their eyes. Some, more sensitive, cast brief glances of compassion, but soon turned their faces away, fearing that they might become targets as well. Meanwhile, the stallholders continued to press the girl, their faces now deformed by sadistic smiles. They grew closer and closer, surrounding Clara like predators around vulnerable prey. The girl, cornered, retreated as far as she could until her back touched the rough fabric of a tent. With nowhere else to go, he breathed hard, feeling the heat of the breath of the men too close. At that moment, the air seemed to freeze. The "E" sound of the fair became muffled in Clara's ears, as if the whole world was distancing. Fear pressed the girl's chest with a suffocating force. His knees threatened to give way. For an instant, time seemed to slow down, stretching every second, into a harrowing eternity. But before the worst happened, a sudden movement cut through the tension-laden air. Something was about to change. The moment the air seemed to weigh down Clara's small shoulders, as if the world itself was about to crush her under the weight of humiliation, something broke the muffled silence that enveloped the scene. A different, unexpected noise echoed among the tents, a firm, dry growl charged with surprising force. It was a sound that did not match the climate of contempt that reigned there until then. The growl did not come from any of the men who surrounded her, nor from anyone in the apathetic crowd. He was actually coming under one of the nearby stalls, where a pile of boxes provided shade. From the interior of that shadow, the thin figure of a stray dog emerged. His disheveled and dirty fur revealed a long journey through the rough sidewalks of the city. The thin ribs were drawn under the grimy skin, but his eyes shone with unexpected force, as if there resided a primitive, pure courage, which knew no fear in the face of injustice. Without hesitation, the animal moved forward steadily, growling loudly, exposing its yellowed teeth in a show of authority that no one expected to witness at that moment. The attackers, taken by surprise, instinctively retreated. His mocking smiles disappeared in the blink of an eye, replaced by expressions of bewilderment and discomfort. The dog, attentive, positioned himself between Clara and the men, keeping his gaze fixed on each of them, as if daring anyone to take one more step towards the girl. His firm paws on the ground and his panting chest showed that he was willing to protect this child to the limit of his strength. The silence that had once been an accomplice to cowardice now seemed to carry a different weight. The crowd, previously indifferent, watched with a mixture of surprise and tension at this unlikely turnaround. The contrast was almost poetic. A helpless child, surrounded by strong and cruel men, being defended by a simple abandoned dog who had appeared as if he knew exactly what to do, as if his destiny was to protect precisely that girl. Clara, still, trembling, fell to her knees. Her legs, finally overcome by the weight of fear and tension, gave way when they felt the protective presence by her side. With tears now streaming freely down her pale face, she extended her arms toward the animal. His fingers, still cold, sank into the dog's matted, rough fur, seeking in him the solace that the world around him had denied him. It was as if, at that moment, all the solitude that had always accompanied her had been, for a brief moment, interrupted. By the arrival of that strange ally, the dog did not move. He stood firm, attentive, growling low, as if to say without words that she was safe as long as he was there. The men hesitated for a few seconds, exchanging puzzled looks. The silent audience seemed at last to have woken up to the absurdity of the situation. Some faces showed a certain relief that finally someone, even if it was an animal, had done what everyone there in their cowardice had refused to do: protect. One of the stallholders took a step back, mumbling something inaudible, while the most aggressive, the one who had tried to knock down the flowers, was irritated by the scene. His face hardened, but in the face of the dog's determination he also retreated. None of them seemed willing to risk a confrontation with that unexpected protector. It was not the size of the animal that intimidated them, but the intensity of its presence, the sincere ferocity that only those who have known pain and the street could carry in their eyes. The crowd remained static, watching this improbable scene of quiet courage. Some began to murmur among themselves, as if they now realized the weight of their own omission. Other people looked away, embarrassed that they hadn't been the ones to reach out before it was necessary for a dog to do what humans failed to do. Clara remained there, hugging the dog, feeling the warmth of his body warm her cold hands. For the first time in a long time, he had found a shelter, even if it was in the shape of 4 legs and dirty fur. The animal, in turn, kept watch. Her attentive ears and her gaze fixed on the men still did not allow any relaxation. There, in that small space on the floor of the fair, an unlikely but unbreakable alliance had been formed. The stallholders, realizing that they had lost control of the situation, began to disperse little by little. The evil laughter ceased altogether, replaced by grumbling and reproachful looks now coming from some customers, who finally realized the monstrosity they had witnessed without intervening. The crowd began to break the circle around the girl and the dog, each slowly resuming their shopping routine, as if trying to erase from their memory the shameful scene they had witnessed. But for Clara and her new partner, that moment had marked the beginning of something that would change their lives in profound ways. The girl, still kneeling, caressed the animal with affection and silent gratitude. She didn't know where he had come from, nor why he had chosen to defend her. She just felt, with a new and unknown intensity, that she was no longer alone. The dog, in turn, seemed equally comfortable next to her, as if that meeting was the fulfillment of a destiny traced long before they both arrived at that market morning. The two of them stood there united, while the life around them slowly resumed its indifferent course. But in their hearts, everything had changed. Gradually, the movement in the fair decreased, and the biting cold of the morning gave way to a slight heat brought by the first rays of the more intense sun. Clara, with the flowers still crumpled between her fingers and the dog now lying next to her, felt a silent hope sprout within her chest. Unknowingly, she and her protector were only at the beginning of a story that still held surprising revelations. In the days that followed that morning, marked by humiliation and the unexpected act of courage, Clara's routine at the market gained a new presence. The dog, as if he had taken on a silent mission, began to accompany her in all her steps. Where she had previously walked alone through the narrow alleys of the fair, now the girl had that thin and attentive figure by her side, always a few centimeters ahead or to the side, as if she were mapping the terrain looking for any sign of threat. His eyes, though they still bore the marks of abandonment, shone with a serene determination, and his ears remained up, catching every sound around him. The presence of the animal did not go unnoticed by the fair's goers. Those who had previously ignored it or worse despised it now found themselves touched by that unlikely partnership. There was something deeply moving about the image of the plainly dressed girl, holding her modest bouquet, faithfully accompanied by that stray dog. It was as if together they formed a fragile but indestructible unit. Many customers, previously indifferent, now stopped in front of Clara, not only to buy some flowers but also to pet the dog, exchange a brief smile, or even leave a few extra coins. Some offered pieces of bread, fruit, and even small treats to the animal, who received everything with a calm and suspicious look, but without ever moving away from the girl. Clara's sales, although still modest, began to improve, not for the quality of the flowers, which have always been beautiful in their simplicity, but for the untold story that now accompanied each small bouquet delivered. People saw in this duo something greater than simple survival. They saw the strength of a bond that had been born in adversity, the reflection of a pure and spontaneous loyalty. Compassion, previously absent, began to germinate discreetly among the tents. During the nights when the cold of the city was pressing and the market emptied, Clara and her companion would retire under a marquee near the market. There they shared the warmth of their bodies and the silence of the empty streets. The girl improvised small cardboard beds and worn blankets she found, while the dog lay next to her, always attentive to the noises of dawn. Together, they faced the cold, loneliness, and the weight of a world that did not always offer shelter to those who had little. But there was something about the dog that stood out beyond his unwavering loyalty. Around his dirty neck and hidden under the tangle of fur hung an old collar. The leather, dried out by time and abandonment, still resisted, but already had cracks and deep marks. The most curious detail, however, was the small metallic pendant attached to the collar. Although crumpled and worn, it was still possible to see engraved on it a single letter, L. Clara often ran her thin fingers over the cold metal, trying to imagine the meaning of that initial. Could it be the dog's name, or would it belong to someone who once loved and lost it? This small clue of mystery, although silent, began to generate questions that swirled around the girl's mind in the long nights under the marquee. Who would be the real owner of that animal? How had he gotten there? And why had she chosen her among so many faces in that busy fair? It wasn't just any dog. It seemed loaded with a history that remained hidden, as if it kept secrets from a past not yet revealed. In the following mornings, Clara noticed a new type of attention coming from some of the fairgoers. People who had never spoken to her now stopped to observe the dog's pendant, some even risking discreet questions about its origin. There were ancient merchants who looked at the animal for a long time, as if trying to search their memory for some lost memory. The mystery surrounding the collar began, little by little, to spread among the most curious. Some suggested that he might have run away from a house long ago. Others bet that perhaps he belonged to a family from another neighborhood, or even from another city. But no one had concrete answers, only assumptions fueled by the fascination of the story that the two now carried. Even with so many questions hanging in the air, the dog seemed indifferent to the speculations. For him, the only thing that mattered was that girl who walked by his side, with whom he shared the bread, the cold and the looks full of meaning that they exchanged with every small gesture. It was a silent, deep connection, built not with words but with gestures of care and mutual surrender. As the days progressed, the fair was no longer a scene of humiliation for Clara. There were still spiteful looks here and there, but the dog's constant presence deterred any attempt at intimidation. Those who had previously mocked now preferred to keep a respectful distance. The mere fact of seeing them together, so improbably allies, aroused in others something between respect and reflection. Many wondered how that child, alone in the world, had managed to win such loyalty from an animal that, like her, knew the pains of the streets. Despite the seemingly stabilized routine, the presence of that small pendant continued to cast shadows of mystery over the dog's past. Clara, even without answers, began to feed within her a strange feeling that this meeting was not the work of chance. There was something greater, invisible to the common eye, leading the steps of the two along paths still unknown. And unknowingly, with each new morning at the fair, they approached a destination that would change their lives in a profound way. Saturday dawned with a different glow. The sky, clear and of an intense blue, seemed to announce a busy day at the fair. The stalls soon filled with vibrant colors, with sounds that intertwined in a hurried chorus of voices offering fresh fruits, freshly picked vegetables, warm breads, and colorful fabrics. The smell of coffee being strained in the small food stalls mixed with the scent of Clara's flowers, which once again positioned itself in its usual corner, now accompanied by its inseparable four-legged protector. The dog, lying at the girl's feet, kept his eye attentive, as he had always done since the day he appeared, protecting her from the dangers that the streets and people could bring. His presence was already part of the fair's landscape. Many customers already recognized them, exchanged discreet looks. Some even smiled when they saw that unlikely partnership. Over time, both became almost a small attraction among the regulars. The flower girl and the faithful dog, always together, always silent, like two souls who found refuge in each other. However, on that Saturday, something subtle and almost imperceptible began to alter the routine that, until then, had been gaining some balance. Among the hurried crowd, a middle-aged man with an upright posture and firm steps emerged. His presence contrasted with the chaotic pace of the fair. He dressed with discreet elegance, which immediately set him apart from the rest. His hands, firm, held a small folded newspaper, but his eyes seemed not to follow him. They were fixed, in only one direction, in the direction of Clara and the dog. For a few moments the man stopped at a safe distance, as if he was gathering the courage to approach. His eyes, teary and attentive, scanned every detail of the scene. The girl with her simple flowers and worn dress, the dog with her antique collar, the metallic pendant that shone briefly in the sunlight whenever the animal changed position. There was in his countenance something deeper than mere curiosity. There was recognition, a kind of pain mixed with contained hope, as if seeing a ghost from the past. The dog, in turn, was the first to notice the stranger's presence. He stood up slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck slightly bristling, as he always did at any new approach. His eyes met the man's, and for a brief moment, time seemed suspended. There were no barks or growls, just that silent instant, charged with something invisible but palpable. A kind of silent recognition, a distant memory that somehow awakened in both of them. Finally, the man took a deep breath and took a few cautious steps in Clara's direction. His face, despite maintaining a certain firmness, betrayed the emotion. That dominated him. It was not fear nor mere curiosity. It was something denser, like an old weight that he carried, and that suddenly seemed to take shape there, in front of that unlikely duo. He approached with a calculated delicacy, avoiding sudden movements so as not to frighten either the girl or the animal. His eyes fixed again on the dog's collar. That crumpled pendant, the engraved initial, the aged leather. Everything was there, intact in his memory. Every little detail seemed to confirm what her heart was already beginning to suspect, but which reason still resisted accepting. Clara, when she noticed the approach, shrank slightly, instinctively protecting her flowers against her chest. Although there was no aggressiveness in the man's gestures, fear was already part of his nature. Each new face could mean danger, and she had learned to always keep a certain emotional distance from any stranger. Her large, attentive eyes followed, his every move trying to decipher his intentions. The dog remained motionless next to the girl, like a silent sentry still on alert, but without showing hostility. His eyes turned from the man to Clara and back to the man, as if trying to understand that new development. The man leaned slightly, allowing the sunlight to better illuminate the pendant. The recorded lyrics, even worn out by time, shone clearly enough to confirm what his eyes could no longer deny. A slight tremor ran through his hands. It was as if, suddenly, the entire past invaded him with full force. But even in the face of that avalanche of feelings, he kept his voice low and serene as he tried to communicate with the girl. Clara's heart was beating fast. There was something strange about that look, something that mixed sadness, relief, and a kind of quiet affection. There seemed to be no danger, but there were no answers either. Everything was new, and the girl felt that this meeting was not just another chance at the fair. Something was hidden behind that careful approach, something she still couldn't fully understand. As the man moved a little closer, his gaze now wandered between the girl and the dog. His mind seemed to be searching for answers to questions that had been with him for years. That collar, that pendant, that dog. Everything led to a still painful past which, until then, he believed to be immutable. But now in front of that child and that animal, the pieces of an old puzzle seemed to want to rearrange themselves in an unexpected way. As much as he struggled internally to maintain his composure, the man began to feel the emotional barriers dissolving. With every detail he observed, with every careful breath he controlled, certainty grew within him, like a wave about to break. And even without revealing all the questions and answers kept in his chest, something bigger, invisible, and mysterious was already beginning to trace the next step of that story, intertwined by destinies that until that moment seemed so far away. The air seemed denser around that small encounter. The man stood in front of Clara and the dog, as if every second of silence carried decades of memories and scars still open. His eyes, which until recently he had observed from afar, now traveled to a past that, even trying to bury, never stopped pulsing in his mind. The mere glow of that letter engraved on the animal's pendant had unleashed a torrent of sights, sounds, and feelings that returned as if time had never passed. Years ago, his life had been completely different. There was love. There was a house, full of laughter, and a daughter who was the center of his entire universe. She loved animals, especially that dog that, as a puppy, she had chosen at the shelter, with a glint of happiness in her eyes. From day one, the two became inseparable. It was impossible to see the girl walking through the streets of the neighborhood without the dog by her side, jumping, attentive, like a faithful and playful shadow. His daughter cared for him with an almost maternal affection, and the animal responded with pure and unquestioning loyalty. The years passed, and the bond between the two only strengthened, but fate, relentless in its unpredictability, decided to cut that thread of happiness in a brutal way. On a rainy afternoon during a simple walk, the unexpected happened. A fast, violent, and absurd accident took the girl's life definitively. In the confusion of the rescue and the tragedy, the dog disappeared. The searches were intense, the entire neighborhood mobilized, but nothing of the animal. The man, shattered, suddenly found himself alone with the emptiness of loss, magnified even more by the absence of the faithful companion who had always been with his daughter. The dog seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth, as if carried along by the very pain of the accident. In his heart, he always believed that the animal somehow had not resisted either. The years passed, each day dragging the weight of that absence. The walls of the house became silent. The empty rooms echoed memories that insisted on remaining. The man immersed himself in work, in routine, trying to stifle the longing that gnawed at him. But he never managed to erase the vivid images of his daughter running through the yard, always with the dog, just a few steps away. It was a memory that came back every night, especially in those moments of absolute silence, when no external noise could silence the echo of the memories. Now, years later, there he was, standing at the fair, in front of that orphan girl and the dog he believed he would never see again. It was like watching a silent miracle, an unlikely reunion that her mind struggled to comprehend. The collar, the pendant with his daughter's initial, the look of the animal that somehow still carried, the same attentive glow as when he was young. Everything pointed to an almost impossible but undeniable reality. The dog had survived. Somehow, after the accident, he wandered the streets, faced abandonment, hunger, cold, and now, mysteriously, he had become the guardian of that other child, as lonely and helpless as his daughter had once been. As much as emotion consumed him inside, the man tried to keep his composure in front of the girl. His heart was pounding, his hands discreetly trembling, but his mind was already lost in questions that could no longer be contained. How had that animal, which had once been his daughter's faithful companion, found just that girl? What had led him to her? Would it be chance? Was it a quirk of fate? Or perhaps something greater, something that transcended logic and reason, uniting two beings marked by similar losses? As his thoughts swirled in a confused whirlwind, his eyes turned to Clara. The girl, still suspicious, held the flowers to her chest, as she always did in the face of any approach. But now, there was something different about her. Not just fear or insecurity, but a kind of unconscious familiarity with that man who watched her so much. As if, inexplicably, an invisible force was already connecting their stories long before that meeting happened. The dog, always attentive, remained by the girl's side, watching the man's every move with watchful but calm eyes. There was no hostility in his behavior, just a quiet firmness, as if he recognized something in the eyes of that stranger that made him accept his presence there. It was as if, even after so much time and suffering, the animal still kept the deep memory of that old bond, and knew in the instinct that animals carry that the reunion was now no longer a threat, but the beginning of something that needed to happen. The man remained motionless, taking in every detail of the scene in front of him. Clara's worn dress, her bare feet, her thin hands holding the flowers, and that dog that, by unimaginable paths, had found a new girl to protect. Everything seemed to carry a greater symbolism, as if destiny itself was there before his eyes, sewing the loose pieces of broken stories. And the more he observed, the more the feeling grew within him that this was not just a reunion with the past, but perhaps a second chance that life, mysteriously, gave him. The connection between the three hung in the air, invisible but undeniable, as the buzz of the fair continued around, as if the outside world was oblivious to the depth of that instant that only they shared. In the days following that first meeting, loaded with contained tension and mystery, the man began to return to the market frequently. Always discreet, he kept a certain distance at first, as if respecting the space of the girl and the dog, but his eyes did not fail to accompany them with every movement. The scene of that frail child, selling flowers next to his faithful protector, seemed to hypnotize him. There was something there that held him deeply, an invisible thread that prevented him from simply going on with his life as if nothing had happened. Gradually, his presence began to become familiar to Clara. At first, the girl watched him with the same silent suspicion with which she looked at any stranger. Years of abandonment and suffering had taught her to be cautious. No one had ever truly cared about his well-being. Whenever someone approached, it was out of interest, curiosity, or worse, out of malice. But there was something different about that man. He didn't ask invasive questions. He didn't try to force her closer. He just appeared, observed, and from time to time, discreetly left something within reach of the girl. First, there were small packages with fresh breads and fruits. Then a carefully folded sweater, left near the corner where Clara and the dog spent the nights under the marquee. On another day, a pair of almost new sandals deposited while the two were sleeping. All done in silence, without fanfare, with the care of someone who did not want to scare, but wished in some way to offer a little relief to that child and his companion. Over time, Clara's natural resistance gradually softened. The nights of intense cold became less cruel with the blanket that now warmed her. Mornings began with a slightly less empty stomach, thanks to the soft bread he found when he woke up. Even without exchanging words, she understood that this man was trying to help her in a respectful way, without demanding anything in return. The dog, always attentive, also perceived the intention of that stranger. Her eyes stopped following the man's steps with tension and began to observe him with an almost complicit neutrality, allowing him to get a little closer with each new encounter. It was at this delicate and careful pace that one day the conversation finally took place. Sitting next to the flower stall, with the dog lying between them, the man, in a serene voice, began to ask simple questions, trying to understand who that girl was, where she had come from, what story had brought her there. Clara, still shy, took a long time to find words. But there was something about his quiet presence that made her, for the first time in a long time, feel safe enough to open small cracks in her hitherto hidden life. With a low and paused voice, she told fragments of a story marked by absences. He said he never met his parents. I didn't know who they were, how they were, or where they could be. All she knew about her origin was what she heard as a child inside the orphanage where she had been left as a baby. No family member showed up to pick her up, no visits, no promise of adoption. Just long, cold days where silence filled in the gaps of the childhood he didn't have. The orphanage, a place that was supposed to be a shelter, ended up becoming another scene of pain. Clara recounted with a sad twinkle in her eyes the mistreatment she suffered there. The physical aggressions, the constant humiliations, the scarce food, the inhuman punishments. This was not a home. It was just another kind of prison, where childhood was quickly consumed by the need for survival. At the age of 7, seized by a desperate impulse, she ran away. Aimlessly, he walked through the streets of the city until he found the cold sidewalks and deserted squares, which have since become his only home. Since that escape, every day has been a silent battle against abandonment, fear, and hunger. He learned to hide from the dangers of the night, to look for scraps of food, to find small, safe corners where he could rest. At each dawn, the fight resumed. Wildflowers became his form of sustenance. He learned how to pick them, make simple little arrangements, and sell them at the market, always hoping to get a few coins that would allow him to survive another day. Listening to the girl's account, the man felt his chest tighten. Each word seemed to sew a new layer of pain on the already heavy load of guilt and longing she carried. There was an echo of the loss in her story that also tore him apart. Both had been victims of an abandonment imposed by fate, in different but equally cruel ways. And now, almost unbelievably, their trajectories had crossed there, in that piece of fare under the watchful eye of a dog that carried on its neck the silent mark of an unresolved past. The man began to realize that chance, or perhaps something greater that he himself did not understand, had led him there not only to find the animal he believed he had lost, but also to find this girl, whose eyes held the same loneliness that he knew so well. The questions began to grow within him, not only about the dog's past, but now, above all, about Clara's past. Who were his parents? How had he ended up in that orphanage? Is there a deeper connection between their stories? Something other than coincidence? As the day progressed and the movement of the fair followed its usual course, that silent conversation left an invisible trail of emotions between them. The connection that was beginning to form was no longer just one of compassion. There was, in that unlikely encounter, the seed of something much greater, still shrouded in mystery, but loaded with a meaning that time was beginning, little by little, to reveal. The days that followed that conversation were filled with a quiet restlessness. The man, even maintaining the routine of small help and discreet conversations with Clara at the fair, felt a growing urgency within him, as if each new information revealed by the girl pushed him closer to something he could not yet name. The loose pieces of that story, so distinct and distant in appearance, began to sketch the contours of a larger and deeper picture. The dog, with its engraved pendant, remained as the silent bridge between two worlds that, until then, seemed to have no connection. The man's mind could not rest. The coincidences were too great to be just the result of chance. The girl's approximate age, the length of time she had been left in the orphanage, the sudden disappearance of the dog after the accident that had taken her daughter, everything seemed to revolve around the same invisible axis. It was as if fate, in its silent complexity, was pulling long-forgotten threads, sowing new possibilities from the wreckage of broken lives. Moved by this restlessness that he could no longer contain, he decided to delve into the girl's past. It began discreetly, gathering public information, visiting old registry offices, sifting through adoption and abandonment records. It was not a simple path. The cold bureaucracies of official papers almost always told incomplete stories, full of gaps and administrative silences. But he was determined. Each little piece of data, each name lost in dusty files, each date recorded as a simple formality, became for him fundamental pieces of a puzzle that needed to be assembled. In one of these searches, he gained access to the records of the old orphanage where Clara had been left as a baby. The yellowed sheets had dry notes, made by employees who at the time only complied with protocols. But there, in the midst of shallow and cold information, something finally caught his attention. An incomplete, almost illegible name, hastily filled in the child's entry form. There was no identification of the parents, just a vague observation that the child had been delivered anonymously by a visibly shaken young woman who did not want to reveal her identity. The most disturbing detail came when he crossed that date with the records of his daughter's accident. The proximity of the events was too disturbing to be a mere coincidence. Only a few weeks separated the accident from Clara's entry into the orphanage. The man's heart raced. A whirlwind of possibilities began to swirl in his mind with an almost unbearable force. It was then that, in an additional effort, he gained access to old medical documents linked to the orphanage, in which there was a forgotten fact. A preliminary genetic test had been carried out on the baby at the time to verify health conditions. The record indicated a rare blood type, the same one he and his daughter shared. There, engraved in small print, was the missing clue. A genetic trait that, although it was not yet a definitive proof, ignited in him a silent and overwhelming certainty. With each discovery, a clearer image began to form. His daughter, still alive before the accident, had probably had a hidden relationship, perhaps out of fear, insecurity, or youth, from which that child had resulted. Clara was, in fact, the result of a chapter that he was completely unaware of in his daughter's life, a piece of history that had been hidden, perhaps as an attempt at protection or fear of judgment. And now, years later, fate, with its enigmatic precision, placed him in front of his own granddaughter, without either of them knowing until then. The man felt the ground disappear beneath his feet for a moment. It was an overwhelming weight of mixed emotions, joy at the discovery, pain at the late revelation, guilt for not having known before, and a bitter relief at finally understanding the hidden workings of that story. The dog, who had escaped in the confusion of the accident, had wandered the streets for all these years, surviving as best he could until he found, in an almost supernatural way, the very girl to whom fate bound him by blood and memory. It was as if, guided by something greater, he had been the silent instrument of an impossible reunion. Now, With this new truth pulsating in his veins, the man saw Clara with new eyes. She was no longer just the fragile girl at the fair, nor just the brave orphan fighting for survival. She was his family. It was the last living link left of his daughter. Blood of your blood. What was once compassion now overflowed with responsibility, with latent love, with an almost visceral need to protect her, to rebuild with her all that the tragedy had destroyed. Yet, even in the face of this transformative discovery, man knew that there was still delicacy to be maintained. I couldn't just reveal everything abruptly. He needed to find the right moment, the right way to build this new bridge with Clara, allowing that little by little she could also recognize in him the bond that fate had carefully sown over the years. And as he matured this step, the bond between them continued to grow, silent but stronger and stronger, under the watchful eye of that dog who, more than anyone, seemed to have understood the true connection between those two hearts a long time ago. The weeks that followed were filled with a different silence, loaded with meaning. The man, now in possession of the truth that time had finally revealed, walked every day to the market with a heavy but firm heart. At each visit, he watched Clara, with a look that mixed tenderness, relief, and a deep emotion that was difficult to describe. There was something magical about the mere fact of seeing her there, smiling with small blindfolds, playing with the dog, living her innocent routine without imagining how much her life was about to change. The girl continued to look at him with the same mixture of curiosity and restrained gratitude, already accustomed to the presence of that gentleman who, although he never demanded anything from her, always appeared with a gesture of care. The fresh bread, the ripe fruits, the clean blanket left in the marquee, the small gifts that, without fanfare, softened her daily life. Now, however, there was something else. She felt, even without knowing why, a strange security in those eyes that always searched for her in the crowd. While the mornings of the market were taking place, the man had already discreetly started what would be the new chapter of that story. Armed with the documents obtained during his silent investigation, he began the legal process of adoption. The authorities, when checking the records of the orphanage, the absence of close relatives and, above all, the blood tie that was now proven, offered no resistance. The pieces fit together with indisputable clarity. Clara, abandoned years before, was his biological granddaughter. The invisible link that fate had woven during all those years now found the formal recognition it deserved. There were days of bureaucracy, signed papers, meetings with social workers, and discreet trips to the registry office, all conducted with extreme care so as not to scare the girl. He knew that this moment, although he waited for with anxiety and love, needed to be conducted in her time. Clara carried deep marks of life on the streets, of early abandonment and repeated disappointments. It would not be with quick words or official papers that the scars that the world imposed on him would be erased. It was necessary to respect the rhythm of her fragile heart, to allow her to build confidence in the new reality that was slowly forming around her. On the day set to make the adoption official, the man prepared everything with silent affection. The new clothes chosen carefully, the simple bow in the hair, the clean and comfortable shoes. Clara, still not fully understanding what that day represented, felt something different hanging in the air. A sweet expectation, mixed with a shy fear that she could no longer disguise in her big, attentive eyes. At the registry office, when the officer finally declared the legally established bond, the man could barely hold back his tears. There, in front of the authorities and with the signature that sealed the fate of both, he saw the rebuilding of what he imagined he had lost forever. Not only did he recover the dog, his faithful companion from past memories, but he also gained the chance to revive the paternal love now transformed into grandfather's love, through that girl that fate had mysteriously put back in his life. When they left the building, they followed in silence to the house that from then on would be Clara's new home. There were no luxuries, but everything about her exuded warmth. The walls, once silent and cold, now gained sounds of light footsteps, suppressed laughter and excited barking. The dog, when he crossed the door of the old house again, seemed to immediately recognize the space he had once shared with his first owner. He walked through the yard, sniffed out old chants, and in an instinctive movement lay down under the tree where he had so often played years before with the man's daughter. For Clara, the impact of that new space was immediate. His eyes roamed every detail as if entering a distant world, inaccessible until recently. The bedroom with a soft bed, the kitchen scented with the aroma of hot food, the folded and fragrant clothes waiting on top of the dresser. Everything was new, but it carried a familiar warmth that she had never experienced. For the first time in his short life, he felt the weight of fear slowly being replaced by the light weight of security. The most symbolic moment of that new story, however, happened a few days later, during a sunny morning in the backyard. Clara, now with her face illuminated by a smile full of life, knelt on the lawn and wrapped the dog in her small arms. He, calm and faithful as always, rested his head on the girl's lap, while his new grandfather watched them from afar, his eyes moist, and his heart overflowing. In that instant, the past and the present seemed to finally find peace. Silent tears streamed down the man's cheeks, not of sadness but of relief and gratitude. After years of pain, loss, and absence, life offered him a second chance, not to erase what was gone, but to reconstruct with new meanings what fate, in its silent wisdom, had sown with such precision. The dog, who had wandered the streets for so long, had accomplished a mission that no human would be able to accomplish, to tie up the loose ends of a shattered family and lead two lost hearts back to the warmth of a home. Now, together, grandfather, granddaughter, and the rediscovered dog followed their routines under the same roof, sharing simple meals, short walks around the neighborhood, and quiet nights in which the silence of the house was filled with the soft sound of the breath of those who could finally sleep peacefully. And as the days passed, everyone carried, even without having to say it out loud, the certainty that fate, sometimes, uses the most unlikely paths to reunite those who, one day, seemed irretrievably lost. And so in a house that once knew silence, now there is laughter, light steps, and the quiet breathing of someone who has finally found a home. Clara, with her books on her way to school, the dog running free through the yard, and her grandfather, rediscovering with each small gesture the true meaning of starting over. All of this is sewn together by invisible threads that only fate, with its silent wisdom, is able to intertwine. If this story touched you in any way, leave here in the comments the phrase, "Fate writes right in mysterious lines," so I know you've been with me this far. And if this connection did you good, leave your like. It helps you keep bringing heartwarming stories. Oh, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. There is a video here, on the side that tells a story as exciting as this one. Click and stay with me there.